Hi, good morning. This is Marie from Chicago Detours. I am out in Ravenswood today, and we are going to be talking about how to identify different building types in Chicago neighborhoods. So specifically today, I'm looking at a few different buildings in the Ravenswood neighborhood, but this type of looking at different buildings would apply to a lot of different neighborhoods. With this little couple blocks that we're looking at, I'm not going to be able to find every type of building, but this will cover 4 or 5 buildings at least. And I'm also going to be talking about how you can kind of learn to identify characteristic features of the buildings and how you can learn to kind of date them, give at least sort of rough characteristics of the buildings by the decades that they were built, and some kind of things that you can look for when you're on your neighborhood walks yourself. So welcome everybody. I can see people joining. Hi Gerald, hi Bonnie, hi Asami just joined, so welcome. So I'm going to start, and for people who are curious, we are on Berthoud, just a couple blocks south of Montrose, and we're going to be walking north up Winchester as we go. So we're going to get started by looking at the building that is right behind me here. So let me turn around and flip the camera. Here we go. And you're going to see a lot of snow today as well, which I'm going to have to navigate carefully. So thanks for your patience as I carefully watch my steps. So this first building that we're looking at is a great example of a worker's cottage. So a worker's cottage is a really common type of building in early Chicago, one of the earliest types of housing that you would see in the 1870s, 1880s, built up right after the Chicago fire. And it was very common because it was so easy to build. So one of the ways you can identify a worker's cottage when you see it is that it has a very simple shape. So the way I like to describe these to kind of help remember them is that they look like a children's drawing of a house. So when you look at the front of it, you see how it just has a simple roof shape. It just comes up to a simple peak, just a point, and then it has a door, has a couple windows. This one has a nice bay window and it has a porch, so it's a little bit more complex. Sometimes you see ones that are very, very simple. Those tend to be the very older ones that were built like very quickly after the fire in the 1870s. Maybe they'll just be very simple, just like a box with a roof. So this one is actually a little bit later. It's the 1890s, so you can tell that it is a little bit more complex, has some nice details on it like the porch, but it has that very simple shape that is so typical of the worker's cottage. Now, right next to it, also from the 1890s, so you can see that this neighborhood actually has a really great diversity of housing types, sometimes right next to each other. It's a great example of a Victorian house. And sometimes these ones are the hardest to identify. Sometimes you see a house and you're like, I don't know if it's a worker's cottage or if it's a Victorian. Sometimes there are Victorian style worker's cottages, which kind of complicates things. But this one is a Victorian. Plain and simple. It's extremely easy to tell it's a Victorian, and the way you can tell is because it is so complex in its shape. See, it has a turret, it has a very large wraparound porch. It's a very big Victorian, so that helps. Let me try to walk around and get a better angle of it. And it has a lot of elaborate woodwork. Come around to the other side. So Victorians, or Victorian mansions, Victorian houses, these were common in the 1890s through the 1900s, sometimes 1880s. You'll see kind of a range for a lot of these housing types. But they're known for their more complex shapes. So see how it has like a ton of gables. It has, of course, that big turret. That's kind of its most noteworthy feature. Some icicles coming off the roof. Oh, so picturesque. Belongs on a Christmas card. And they're also known for having mixed textures on the front of the building. So you see how it has shingles going around the turret, but it also has just plain siding on the other parts of the building. So let's continue walking. This is another Victorian right next to it. It's a little more simple in its shape. It's got a little bit of a complex shape to it. And of course, it's got the woodwork. It's got the porch on the front of it. But we're going to keep walking down the neighborhood, see what else we can see. And I'm going to make sure I don't slip on any ice. So one of the most common housing types that you're going to see in this neighborhood and all across Chicago are two flats. Two flats make up something like 60% of all the housing in Chicago. And they were very common in the 1900s through the 1920s. And they were very easy to produce. Here's a great example of one. And we're going to see a bunch more. Make sure I'm not blocking the sidewalk. So there's a great example of a two flat. And I'm going to turn across the street. And we're going to see kind of a row of them all together. Ooh. So two flats were could be produced very quickly. And they were a great housing solution for the mass influx of, snow problem. Hold on. The influx of immigrants coming to Chicago all around that time period. So when you see a bunch of two flats all together in a neighborhood, that's a great indication that the neighborhood grew up around the 19-teens, 1920s, and was probably built up to sort of accommodate maybe an influx of workers from an immigrant population. So you'll see a lot of two flats in like around the K-Town area, right? The Costner and those names escape me. But like, oh my gosh, I can't think of any great examples. They're so common. Avondale has a ton of them. That's a great example. And those were like neighborhoods that had like a large Polish population or a large Czech population. And you'll find advertisements from the turn of the century, like early teens, 1920s newspapers, where two flats were being advertised in Czech or in Polish. And they were a great housing solution for that immigrant population coming into the city so rapidly. Okay. So we've gone through sort of the 1870s, 1880s with the workers' cottages, 1890s, 1900s, Victorians. A lot of these overlap, but they're kind of a good way to ballpark how a neighborhood grew up. And when you see them, if you see a lot of them all together, that's a good way to kind of, guess when that neighborhood developed. When you see a huge mix in one neighborhood, like you see in this neighborhood we're walking through right now, that's an indicator that the neighborhood, kind of had mixed development over time, which is what actually happened here. Just kind of a pause for another look at this one. So here's a great two flat. Kind of pause and take it in. Lots of bricks. Chicago produced a lot of bricks, of course. And taking this one. Now what's different about this one, of course, if you count them, so I slowly pan, 1, 2, 3. So this one is not a two flat, of course, it is a three flat. So this is a slightly different variation of the housing stock in Chicago. If you don't have a two flat, it's got an extra floor on it, it's a three flat. Not that hard to figure out. There's also, slight variations where you put two, three flats together with a central kind of corridor or entryway that connects them. And that's a six flat. So, you kind of mix and match your housing styles. Oh yeah, Dwayne points out, notice bricks on the side and bricks on the front are different. It's actually a really great point. Let me pause and point that out. So the bricks on the side right here are this mixed kind of almost like black and beige. And then the bricks on the front are really nicely colored orange. The bricks on the side are called Chicago Common Brick, and they came from the Chicago River. The bricks on the front would come from other places. They were more carefully produced. The Chicago Common Brick was like dredged out of the Chicago River, like around Goose Island. And it was because of the chemical composition of the clay, they couldn't make it like a really uniform color, but they could produce it very cheaply and very quickly. So they would use it on the backs of the buildings, and then they would use the nicer brick from other places on the front. Okay. So one little variation, again, to point out here, slightly unusual building. It looks exactly like a 2-flat, but it's just a 1-flat. This is not very common, but you will see it sometimes. I've even like looked up in old newspapers, the companies that produced these 2-flats had these kind of variations, but the 1-flat variety just wasn't as common because you get sort of less bang for your buck with your lot size. But you do see them every once in a while. In all the wanderings I've ever done in Chicago, that's the only one I've ever seen. But I saw it in the old newspapers, so I knew it did exist. And I found one. There it was. Okay. So the reason that Ravenswood has kind of a mix of housing types like this is because it grew up at different time periods. Oh, let me see what question I got. What's the difference between a 1-flat and a house? Essentially just the way it was designed. So, I mean, that's a really good question. Like, a 1-flat isn't really a type. It's just that, like, the housing developer that was creating the 2-flats also was making buildings in the same exact model, but without a second floor. So they're very, very rare. As I said, like so rare that it almost isn't a type, like I said. Okay. Now let me see if I can find the little detail on this building I wanted to point out. Okay. So this is, a treacherous sidewalk. Okay. So this is a large apartment building that is, oh shoot. Okay. About to see the camera go flying in the air. That's what you're about to see. Okay. So, I said I was going to help kind of point out details that sometimes can help you identify the ages of a building. So this particular building, thanks Bonnie, yeah, I do need to be careful, has a particular detail above the door that helps you date it, and it's that little Y detail. So that Y is a symbol that you'll sometimes find hidden in the architecture of Chicago called the Chicago Municipal Device, or sometimes it's called the Chicago Y. So it is a symbol that represents the branches of the Chicago River. If you looked at the river from above, it looks like a Y, right? It branches off north and south, shaped like a Y. So that was adopted as an official city symbol in I should have looked it up. In the 19-teens. It's 1916, I think. And so you'll sometimes find it on buildings a little older than that because it was kind of around before it was officially adopted. But it became extremely popular to use it on buildings in the later 19-teens, 1920s. So if you see a building with this Y, very good indicator that the building's from the 1920s. And this building actually has details that are a little bit Art Deco, as you see the sort of geometric symbols around the door. So this building is definitely maybe late teens, but I think 1920s. And that kind of fits for large apartment buildings too. That's when they started really sort of expanding the size of buildings to try to fit more people in, as Ravenswood expanded the industry. and there was more of a need for, more housing for a working population. And that's true across the city as well. Like you'll see larger apartment buildings in the 19-teens, 1920s, in addition to flats. Whew, okay. Back on solid ground. Gotta talk to my neighbors about their shoveling. Okay. So. Now across the street we've got a church, and churches are actually a really great way to kind of get a hint on the history of a neighborhood. Oftentimes they'll have the year they were built somewhere on the building. They'll give you a clue about the original, composition of the neighborhood. If they were, Lutheran, German, Swedish, that gives you some hints. This church is actually a little bit later, so it doesn't give us a lot of hints. But that's just a kind of a good tip. Keep an eye on what churches are in the area. And okay. All right. There's two more buildings I'm going to show you. One's across the street. I might show you from here. I don't think I can cross this snowbank. That actually gives us kind of a good view. Okay. So this house across the street with the kind of horizontal lines and the big porch, there it is. That is a great example of an American Foursquare, which is kind of another kind of rare housing type in Chicago, but you do see it sometimes. And the way to tell an American Foursquare house is that they are square. So that kind of helps identify it. They're a little bit tricky sometimes to identify. Sometimes you have to do kind of process of elimination. Like you look at that, you can tell it's not a worker's cottage because it's nice and big. It's got a big porch. It's not a Victorian though, because it has just a simple roof shape, right? It doesn't have a turret. It doesn't have, complex gables all over it. But it's just kind of a big, giant square, much bigger than a worker's cottage, but simpler in shape than a Victorian, right? So process of elimination is probably an American Foursquare. And when you look at it, it does have kind of the detailing of a Frank Lloyd Wright type building. If you're familiar with his style, sort of horizontal lines, geometric shapes. So that gives you a clue that American Foursquares were influenced by the Prairie School of Architecture. And that came about sort of 19-teens going into the 1920s. And so you can tell that those are a little bit later than the Victorians or the workers' cottages. So this one's more 19-teens. I saw a question, are these old buildings to updates? Have their roofs been done? Great question. Have they had updates to their roofs? Is that what the question is? Yeah, sometimes if you kind of look closely, you'll see that there are definitely additions. And that's a way to kind of, if you're really being careful as you're looking, you can kind of tell this building looks a lot newer, but if I'm looking carefully, I can tell that it's older. And when you peek down the side of a building and you see older bricks, that'll sometimes give you a clue. One of my greatest secrets in looking for the history of my neighborhood is look up the address on Redfin, because it'll tell you when the year the property was built. Makes me look like a real expert. Just a little secret for everybody. All right. One last building on the corner. And this is the type of building that I think Ravenswood is most associated with. Although, as I've shown you, Ravenswood has a huge variety of buildings. and building types. But this is a courtyard apartment. Okay, so courtyard apartments are more common in the 19-teens, 1920s. Kind of mentioned this when we were looking at the Chicago Y symbol. But they were a way to sort of maximize your property space. You'll see them more often on corner lots. As you see here, this is right on the corner of Montrose. There's Montrose. And they also were a development of the progressive movement and a response to the sort of terrible tenement conditions that so many people were living in Chicago and other places, other big cities. People living in poverty and in really terrible, cramped conditions. And so they created these courtyard apartments where everyone has access to a window, at least one, and access to some green space. So by shaping the building around a U with a central courtyard, they're able to sort of maximize the shape of the building in such a way that gives everyone some air, some light, and a little bit of green space. So it's definitely part of the, City Beautiful movement from the 19-teens going into the 1920s, the same movement that gave us the Chicago Park system. So this particular apartment building is called the Royal Arcade. I love it when a building has a name. That also helps you look up an apartment or a building. If you see a name above it, you can Google it. And then sometimes there'll be some historic information about it somewhere online. So that's how I was able to find some information about this one, actually. So the Royal Arcade, and then this one, which is just kind of attached to it, called the Royal Annex. So built by the same developer, but as the name implies, it was added on to it just a couple years later. So I think that one was 1909 and this one's 1911. So these are actually a little early for courtyard buildings, but not out of the realm of possibility. So that is going to conclude our little walking tour of this little corner of Ravenswood and how to identify some neighborhood buildings and some characteristics of those buildings. So I hope that was helpful to everybody. And we're going to be doing these. We are doing these every Wednesday and Saturday at 10:30. So thanks for joining us. We do have virtual events that we are doing periodically. We've got Badass Women of History coming up in March. We have got the 1893 World's Fair event coming up in a week. I don't have my calendar with me. You can look it up at our website, chicagodetours.com, under the virtual events page, the public events page. Please donate if you can. The donation information is on the post. And subscribe to us on YouTube to keep up to date on all of these videos. We will keep posting them and we will keep doing them. We love doing them. It's great to stay in touch with you all. So thanks so much. And we'll see you again on Saturday. Thanks so much. Bye.